program was implemented in 2012 and essentially provided a legal status for recipients for a renewable 2-year term, work authorization, and other benefits, including participation in the Social Security program to 800,000 mostly adult illegal aliens. The policy was implemented unilaterally to great controversy and legal concern after Congress rejected legislative proposals to extend similar benefits on numerous occasions to this same group of illegal aliens. In other words, the executive branch, through DACA, deliberately sought to achieve what the legislative branch specifically refused to authorize on multiple occasions. Such an open-ended circumvention of immigration laws was an unconstitutional exercise of authority by the executive branch. The effect of this unilateral executive amnesty, among other things, contributed to a surge of minors at the southern border that yielded terrible humanitarian consequences. It also denied jobs to hundreds of thousands of Americans by allowing those same illegal aliens to take those jobs. We inherited from our founders and have advanced an unsurpassed legal heritage, which is the foundation of our freedom, our safety, and our prosperity. As Attorney General, it is my duty to ensure that the laws of the United States are enforced and that the constitutional order is upheld. No greater good for the overall health and well-being of our republic than preserving and strengthening the impartial rule of law. Societies where the rule of law is treasured are societies that tend to flourish and succeed. Societies where the rule of law is subject to political whims and personal biases tend to become societies afflicted by corruption, poverty, and human suffering. To have a lawful system of immigration that serves the national interest, we cannot admit everyone who would like to come here. It's just that simple. That would be an open borders policy, and the American people have rightly rejected that. Therefore, the nation must set and enforce a limit on how many immigrants we admit each year, and that means all cannot be accepted. This does not mean they are bad people or that our nation disrespects or demeans them in any way. It means we are properly enforcing our laws as Congress has passed them. It is with these principles and duties in mind, and in light of imminent litigation, that we reviewed the Obama administration's DACA policy. Our collective wisdom is that the policy is vulnerable to the same legal and constitutional challenges that the courts recognized with respect to the DAPA program, which was enjoined on a nationwide basis in a decision that was affirmed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fifth Circuit specifically concluded that DACA had not been implemented in a fashion that allowed sufficient discretion and that DAPA was foreclosed by Congress's careful plan, close quote. In other words, the immigration law that Congress passed foreclosed this possibility of DACA. In other words, it was inconsistent with the Constitution's separation of powers. That decision was affirmed by the Supreme Court on an equally divided basis. If we were to keep the Obama administration's executive amnesty policy, the likeliest outcome is that it would, too, be enjoined just as was DAPA. The Department of Justice has advised the President and the Department of Homeland Security that the Department of Homeland Security should begin an orderly, lawful wind-down, including the cancellation of the memo that authorized this program. Acting Secretary Duke has chosen appropriately to initiate a wind-down process. This will enable the Department of Homeland Security to conduct an orderly change and fulfill the desire of this administration to create a time period for Congress to act should it so choose. We firmly believe this is the responsible path. Simply put, if we are to further our goal of strengthening the constitutional order and the rule of law in America, the Department of Justice cannot defend this overreach. George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley, in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, was clear about the enormous constitutional infirmities raised by this action. He said, quote, in his testimony, "In ordering this blanket exception, President Obama was nullifying part of a law that he simply disagreed with. If a president can claim sweeping discretion to suspend key federal laws, the entire legislative process becomes little more than a pretense. The circumvention of the legislative process not only undermines the authority of this branch," he's referring to the legislative branch, "but destabilizes the tripartite system as a whole." So this is not a little matter. Ending the previous administration's disrespect for the legislative process is an important first step. All immigration policies should serve the interests of the people of the United States, lawful immigrant and native-born alike. Congress should carefully and thoughtfully pursue the types of reforms that are right for the American people. Our nation is comprised of good and decent people who want their government's leaders to fulfill their promises and advance an immigration policy that serves the national interest. We are people of compassion and we are people of law. But there is nothing compassionate about the failure to enforce immigration laws. Enforcing the law saves lives, protects communities and taxpayers, and prevents human suffering. Failure to enforce the laws in the past has put our nation at risk of crime, violence, and terrorism. The compassionate thing to do is end the lawlessness, enforce our laws, and if Congress chooses to make changes to those laws, to do so through the process set forth by our founders in a way that advances the interests of the American people. That is what the President has promised to do and has delivered to the American people. Under President Trump's leadership, this administration has made great progress in the last few months toward establishing a lawful and constitutional immigration system. This makes us safer and more secure. It will further, economically, the lives of millions who are struggling, and it will enable our country to more effectively teach new immigrants about our system of government and to assimilate them to the cultural understandings that support it. The substantial progress in reducing illegal immigration at our border seen in recent months is almost entirely due to the leadership of President Trump and his inspired immigration officers. But the problem is not yet solved, and without more action, we could see illegality rise again rather than be eliminated. As a candidate and now in office, President Trump has offered specific ideas and legislative solutions that will protect American workers, increase wages and salaries, defend the national security, ensure the public safety, and increase the general well-being of the American people. He has worked closely with many members of Congress, including in the introduction of the RAISE Act, which would produce enormous benefits for our country. And this is how our democratic process works. There are many powerful interest groups in the country, and every one of them has a constitutional right to advocate their views and represent whomever they choose. But the Department of Justice does not represent any narrow interest or any subset of the American people. We represent all the American people and protect the integrity of our Constitution. That is our charge. We at the Department of Justice are proud and honored to work to advance this vision for America and to do our best each day to ensure the safety and security of the American people. Thank you very much.
We use the personal information of DACA recipients.
Thank you.
Will you move to the board conveners? Let's see what will happen to the DACA.
And there you have Attorney General Jeff Sessions delivering the news that many people anticipated would come at some point. Hi, everyone. I'm Amna Nawaz in New York. President Trump and his administration have officially rescinded the DACA program. That is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, protecting young people who were brought to America as children from deportation. That is ending effective today. Some details to go through now, and let's break down exactly what this means for the nearly 800,000 young residents who are immediately affected by this decision. Let's go to Rick Klein now, who joins us from our D.C. bureau, ABC's political director. Rick, this was a campaign promise made by candidate Trump. President Trump today made good on that promise.
He made good on the promise, but he also contradicted himself when he said repeatedly that he would take care of the Dreamers and they wouldn't have anything to worry about. This was an extraordinary situation, Amna, where you had the president publicly talking about how difficult this decision was for him. But from a legal perspective, the tone that we just heard from the Attorney General was far different. This was not about compassion for the Dreamers. He said the compassionate thing to do was to follow the law. Repeatedly referred to the so-called Dreamers, 800,000 people brought here as children in an undocumented way as illegal aliens. I think that tone was unmistakable, and I think the tone that he is setting, even if Congress somehow acts in the next couple of months, we don't know where the administration will land on it. I feel like this was a deliberate choice on the part of the administration to make good on that part of the promise and to deliver to the hardliners. This was what, in part, what he was elected on, was this get-tough approach to immigration, undoing some of the Obama reforms, and it's a very stark message that leaves a whole lot of people who only consider themselves to be Americans in limbo for the next several months.
And Rick, it's worth pointing out that he's making this decision against a backdrop in which people actually supported trying to work out some sort of legal path for these so-called Dreamers, the DACA recipients. The latest Pew numbers have 72% saying that allowing immigrants who came to the country illegally as children to remain in the U.S. and apply for legal status should be an important goal for legal policy. Even members of his own party disagreed with this, right?
Well, immigration reform is extraordinarily difficult. This is actually a slice of immigration reform that isn't that hard if you look at where public opinion is, you look at where the politics are. Again, we're talking about 800,000 people brought here as children through no fault of their own. Most of them have known no country other than the United States. Many of them thought they were American citizens until they needed to access their official government documents to get a job or apply to college, something like that. So this was, and again, the only way you qualify is if you kept your nose clean. You can stay out of legal trouble. So this has been a group of people for whom there's been large compassion on both sides of the aisle, and there's been talk of legislative progress. What's made it difficult is the other parts of immigration reform, whether that's other parts of legal and illegal immigration, whether that's border wall funding and the like. It's when you complicate it, when you throw it into that larger mix, that it gets so tough. There have been efforts under Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, Republican Congress, Democratic Congress to try to take care of these so-called Dreamers, and that's why President Obama moved 5 years ago on his own. He said there's just too much frustration, too much uncertainty around these people. He even acknowledged that he was on questionable, kind of shaky legal footing at the time. But now we're hearing from the Trump administration they're going in the other direction. And again, it punts to a Congress that's been simply unable to deal with this issue, no matter how popular, no matter how bipartisan it would seem.
And you're seeing now, we just saw there on a split screen, some of those protests going on right now in Washington, D.C. Obviously, folks gathering and mobilizing in advance of this announcement that was expected for so long. I want to bring in Kate Shaw now, who joins us on the phone. She's ABC News' legal contributor. And Kate, I want to get your take on this because obviously we heard Attorney General Jeff Sessions there mention the unconstitutionality, the legality of the case here. What exactly is the legal landscape when it comes to DACA?
You know, I thought he really overstated the degree to which that's even resolved. So last year, the Supreme Court did tie. It split 4-4 because there was still a vacancy that hadn't been filled by now Justice Neil Gorsuch. So the court tied and did affirm what the lower court had done with expanded DACA and DAPA, so two closely related programs. But two things. One, the Supreme Court has never even approached weighing in on the constitutionality or legality of DACA itself. So that's a totally open legal question. And two, even with respect to these related programs, the court ties and, the Attorney General said, well, it affirmed by an equally divided court. And that's true as a technical matter, but it's not meant to reflect any kind of sense of what individual justices would have believed about the underlying legality of the program. There were a lot of open questions about whether the case was even properly before the the federal courts because Texas was the plaintiff in the case, and there was a question about whether a state even had the authority to go to federal court and challenge a program like this. So that I thought was pretty interesting. You know, it's not at all resolved. I think most legal scholars agree there are some tough both statutory and constitutional questions that DACA raises. So it felt like, you know, a little bit of finger pointing. Well, the Supreme Court has essentially resolved this legal issue, and so we're somewhat bound. I mean, he made a predictive judgment that the Supreme Court would most likely strike DACA down, but I think it overstated the degree to which courts have even resolved this question. So you sort of had, in an interesting way, the executive branch is pointing to Congress and saying this is Congress's job, and pointing to the Supreme Court and saying, well, the Supreme Court has sort of already predetermined that, or at least given strong signals that this program is unlawful, you know, and sort of a hand waving. Well, it's not, you know, it seemed to me to be sort of interesting separation of powers, kind of buck passing, pointing at the other two key institutions and sort of deflecting responsibility over there. And just to say one more thing, there's an interesting contrast when you look at what the administration is saying in the travel ban cases, which is this very expansive conception of the president's power over immigration. Here, the Attorney General seems to be saying, well, this is really Congress's job, not the president's. The previous president overstepped his constitutional bounds in attempting to essentially regulate immigration, but arguably that's just what's happened in the travel ban executive order. So there's some very, I think, pretty sharp tension there.
Well, Kate, I'm glad you raised that, the travel ban. I was going to ask you, because we already know that some people, including the New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, and the New York State Attorney General, have announced that they plan to sue the administration if they rescinded DACA as they have done today. And we don't have final word on that lawsuit. That was announced over the weekend in advance of this, in anticipation of today's announcement. So what would that look like? Could this move today end up the same way as the travel ban?
You know, it does seem to me very likely that we'll get at least a couple of attorneys general, and, you know, at least two have signaled their interest in doing so, who would argue that what the administration did today was procedurally improper. So you couldn't, there are a few different legal theories, but they could say when you have a program like this, you can't just, you know, issue an announcement and a secretarial memorandum and undo a program like this. You need to go through some more extensive process. Interestingly, that's the same argument that was successful in the lower courts, although, as I said, the Supreme Court never addressed the merits of it. But the same argument that was made with respect to DAPA, basically, was that, you know, it was just an order by the secretary, and there wasn't the proper process for putting out a proposal and getting feedback from the public and then formalizing this new program. You can make the same argument in reverse. Whatever the underlying authority of that initial program, it can't be undone quite so cavalierly. So that's one of the legal theories that I imagine we will see if, in fact, these AGs do file these lawsuits. There's also the possibility of some kind of constitutional due process or reliance argument that, you know, 800,000 individuals have relied on the assurances of their government that they will, you know, that they can, in good faith, provide identifying information and that sort of thing without fear of potential recrimination for doing that, and that there's an interest that the law protects that is created by you know, sort of erecting a program like this. And so again, you need to do more than just issue a statement in order to undo a program like that. And maybe you can't undo it at all once it's created. So I think there are a few different legal theories. And so I think you'll have both a lot of, you know, the attention shift to Congress. That's what this statement today said, was sort of Congress, the ball's in your court. And at the same time, I do think we'll see some of these challenges play out very quickly in the federal courts.
All right, let's talk a little bit about what that undoing could look like. I want to bring in ABC's Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, who joins us. He was there in the room with Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And Pierre, maybe you can give us a little bit of background here, because there were some brief remarks delivered there by Mr. Sessions, but there's obviously 800,000 lives that are immediately thrown into uncertainty. Tell me a little bit more about what this looks like moving forward.
Well, Amna, the Attorney General was pretty blunt. He believes that the Obama administration, President Obama specifically, acted unconstitutionally, that in granting this waiver, if you will, for these 800,000, as the Attorney General described them as illegal immigrants, that he overstepped his bounds. The Attorney General was saying that it's the purview of Congress to make these kinds of decisions through legislation, that the President of the United States and Obama did not do that, so he is rescinding the program as of today and basically putting it in the lap of Congress to resolve this issue, Amna.
No.
Information be scrubbed from the
So,
system?
Pierre,
Will
tell
you
me a little
still
bit
have that?
about how we got to this decision in the first place, because obviously there were a lot of things that candidate Trump campaigned on. DACA and the immediate ending of the DACA program was one of them. But do we know a little bit about how we got this decision and why today?
Well, there are a number of conservative groups that had threatened litigation, and the Attorney General spoke to that today. He said that litigation was imminent and that it had to be dealt with. So the Trump White House, if you will, had a deadline of today to respond to how it was going to handle the situation. Now, obviously, on the left, you have people who support what President Obama once did. So now we have a number of state attorney generals, including in New York, threatening to sue in relation to the action that President Trump took today. So this is going to have a fight in court as well as on Capitol Hill.
And Capitol Hill is where all the attention focuses now. Rick Klein, I'd love to bring you in at this point here. Congress is coming back into session. They already have a pretty full plate ahead of them, though. Immediately handed all the immediate response from Hurricane Harvey as well, trying to put together funding for the tens of thousands of people who've applied for help and desperately need it, in addition to everything else, just the regular government business they have to conduct. Can they handle this? Since 2001, they've been trying. Can they get this done?
I think there's no indication in recent history that would suggest that they can. And I think President Trump is among those who has to know that. He has spent a good portion of the summer talking about dysfunctional Congress. Congress was in a bad position in terms of basic operations before President Trump got here, and it has not gotten better. And they have crowded this fall agenda. This adds this other looming deadline because of the limbo that's facing these DACA recipients. I'm struck by the response. It's not just Democrats who are coming out very critical of this. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, very supportive of Republicans. They're saying that this is a misguided step as well. So there's going to be enormous pressure in Congress to try to get this done. But as you mentioned, it gets mixed into so many other issues. President Trump is still talking about the possibility of a government shutdown over border wall funding. That is something that gets into the mix. The debt ceiling, Hurricane Harvey relief, tax reform, which is the big agenda item for the fall. There is a breaking point here. And the president, who loves to throw a lot of things out there and watch other people deal with the consequences, is going to realize that there's a limited capacity for deal-making without his direct involvement. And he has not been effectively involved in the past. I believe that the White House has to know how hard this is for Congress. And it's not just a question of saying, well, go deal with this. Everyone has agreed that DACA recipients, the so-called dreamers, have been an issue that people should be focused on for the better part of a decade. They haven't been able to get it done under the best of circumstances. Now with this looming deadline, with the emotions surrounding this, with the cross-pressures on it, with the splits inside the Republican Party, I think it only gets more difficult.
Pierre Thomas, I'd love to get your take on this, because obviously one of the departments who's going to have to handle this if it does run into trouble, if it gets challenged in a lawsuit moving forward, is the Department of Justice. And is Attorney General Jeff Sessions, what is the plan moving forward now if this ends up going the same way as the travel ban, which is to say sort of mired in a constant legal turmoil?
Well, it's not exactly clear what will happen next, but I think the Attorney General made clear that his department, under his leadership, will work to make sure that the DACA program implemented under Obama is no more. That is what their position will be, and that is what they plan to argue in court when it gets that far.
All right, Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent. Thanks, Pierre. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
I'd love to bring in now to the conversation someone who's been keeping an eye on all of this, obviously very, very closely. Her name is Cyriac Alvarez. She joins us live via Skype from Utah. She is a writer and organizer and a recipient of DACA. Cyriac, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd love to just get your reaction right off the bat here. You heard the announcement of the administration. What's going through your mind right now?
I think a lot of frustration and anger right now, because it is a program that has worked for over 800,000 of us. And he talked about compassion. He talked about doing the right thing. This is so wrong, not only for us, but for everything that we've done for our communities. You're nurses, you're teachers, you're advocates. You're in every single part of American life, yet they still want to end the program. And ending this program is not only going to affect us personally, but it's going to affect every single one of our communities. So I'm frustrated and angry, but however, this doesn't come as a surprise to us. We've been saying this for the past year or so when he was campaigning, because he has explicitly campaigned against anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Cyriac, let me ask you, I know you're an organizer, you speak on behalf of so many others who are recipients of this program, but in terms of your personal story, your life, How is this going to immediately affect you? What is the plan? What's your biggest concern right now?
Of course, my biggest concern, as it has been for the past 5 years, is what's going to be concrete. When is there actually going to be something concrete that recognizes me as an American the way we are, the way 800,000 of us are? I think my immediate concern is understanding what's going to happen next. When will DACA applications continue? Are they going to continue? Just all of these questions about my education, my future, my job, etc.
Tell us a little bit, just in the way of background, Syriac, how exactly did DACA change your life? What came with the ability to get a work permit, to be able to pay taxes, all those things that DACA provided for you? How did your life change?
I received DACA when I was 17 years old, right at the end of high school. So after high school ended, I was able to pave my way for my own education because undocumented students can't apply for federal financial aid. I got scholarships, and I was able to work throughout my undergrad, continue my education, did an internship in Washington, D.C., and just recently graduated from the University of Utah. So DACA allowed me to continue to move forward in my education and now work a full-time job helping my community.
So, Syriac, tell us now, if you had a chance to talk to the people who now hold your fate in their hands. We saw the administration pass the buck over to Congress to say it's your turn to act. What is your message to them?
My message is to work together, to have a bipartisan approach to this that is humane. Because I think a lot of times it's broken up into black and white, wrong and right, but it's not. We're people. This whole issue of immigration isn't black and white. It's not. DACA was never black and white. Immigration reform will never be black and white. And I think it's important to be compassionate with our immigration reform and recognize why we have 11 million undocumented people. It's not by chance. It's not by luck, but by structures that haven't worked. So I urge them to work together, but also urge them to make a reform that actually speaks to a global economy.
Syriac Alvarez joining us live from Utah. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much.
I want to go back now to Kate Shaw, ABC's legal contributor, who joins us on the phone. And Kate, we heard Attorney General Jeff Sessions say there that we must be compassionate people, but also people of the law. Where is the intersection of those two things when it comes to the lives of 800,000 people that have immediately been thrown into uncertainty and turmoil?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be hard to argue, certainly from the perspective of those 800,000 people, that the balance is struck anywhere near compassion. I mean, I think that the law, it's left, I think the status is left, there are a lot of things left somewhat unclear as a legal matter by both this memo and today's announcement. I don't see anything that says the work authorizations that folks have received are automatically revoked. You have the 6-month period. So, but the kind of, the idea of a phase-in, which I think looks quite different from the way the administration rolled out, I think, to pretty universal condemnation, its travel ban announcement. You'll remember it basically took effect immediately, which led to just absolute chaos at international airports across the country as individuals landed, were barred admission, were prevented from boarding flights at international airports. So I think it's pretty widely acknowledged to have been total chaos, and the administration does seem to have learned from that, that when you have, such high stakes for particular individuals involved, you can't just announce radical policy changes overnight, right? You do need to give some kind of phase-in period so that people can put their lives in order. So the protection 6 months from now ends. So that part is clear, but sort of what else it means for individuals, whether they want to make choices about, trying to pursue other avenues of status adjustment, potentially leaving. I mean, I don't know that maybe a really compassionate design would actually sort of involve winding down this particular program because of, maybe good faith legal concerns about the ability of the executive branch to do this thing without Congress, while also figuring out a way to actually assist individuals who had been recipients and reliant upon it in figuring out their next steps. And I didn't really see anything to that effect. We'll see sort of, I know you've been talking about this moving to Congress, and sort of there is this additional legal question, which is, you remember, I thought there was some interesting echoes when the Attorney General said this is not something that should have been done by the executive branch. I don't think President Obama and his administration would have disagreed with that assessment at all, right? I mean, this was something that they tried very hard to get done through Congress, through various iterations of the DREAM Act, and only resorted to this executive action when multiple efforts had failed. And some of those efforts came quite close. And in one instance, I believe it was only because of the filibuster, right, the requirement that the Senate get 60 votes to approve legislation, that one version of the DREAM Act, fell just a little bit short. So I think there'll be this question, having passed the buck to Congress, will the administration support Congress in its effort to try to do something legislatively? And if that happens, I think that even the Obama administration would agree that that's a more durable solution. But it's really hard to know from right here how all of this will play out.
All right, Kate Shaw, ABC's legal contributor, joining us on the phone. Thanks, Kate. Rick Klein, down in our D.C. bureau. Kate mentioned there President Obama. Obviously, he was referenced in the Attorney General's remarks as well. We've heard before that President Obama felt he could be moved to speak or to speak out if something concerning the Dreamers were to come out. Do we anticipate hearing from him?
We do expect he'll make some kind of a statement, maybe something on Facebook or social media, as opposed to going to the cameras. I've talked to former Obama aides about how the former president thinks of himself in the Trump era. He is cognizant of the fact that there are times where him speaking out may be exactly what Donald Trump wants. And he wants to make sure that he doesn't become a foil for the criticism. The debate over Obamacare, for instance, is one area where you saw President Obama not part of the discussion. And I think there was reticence around that because that would actually galvanize the Republican Party. That could actually solidify opposition to the law to have him back out there as a public face. But he said at one of his final news conferences, one of the final things he said as a public statement as president, if there were times that American values seemed to be on the line, that you saw this new administration come in and contravene what he viewed was the best interest of American values, he would feel compelled to step forward. And he mentioned the Dreamers as one area. Look, and Kate is right. He didn't want to have to do this as an executive action. He wanted to do it legislatively. It's precisely, though, because it's so difficult to get that done, though, that he felt like he needed to act the way he did and move to grant this special status to these 800,000 individuals. So the fact that President Trump coming in now and saying, well, now Congress has to do it, I believe that's a very flawed misreading of the political realities. If you believe that suddenly a new deadline on top of everything else out there is going to galvanize action. They could get a Dreamer bill passed probably tomorrow if that's all they were talking about. But Congress is going to try to put other things in there. And the president himself will want to have funding for the border wall. They'll try to make it bigger. And that's where things start to collapse. And that's where this becomes difficult. And that's where a whole lot of people who have enjoyed this status and are now contributing as out of the shadows members of society, they have to be concerned about today's announcement.
And Rick, it also strikes me that, as President Trump has now tweeted about this morning, he told Congress to get ready to do their jobs. He's clearly saying, it's out of my hands. You have to make something happen now. It's a breathtaking gamble to take with the lives of nearly 800,000 people who were an average of 6.5 years old when they were first brought to this country to say, we're going to trust the folks who've not been able to do anything about this since 2001 to handle this for you now.
That's precisely right. And it's not just the fact that you have these people who you can believe that there's a moral argument for them to enjoy this special protected legalized status. It's also that these people volunteered, came out of the shadows, gave their information, their personal information, their cell phone numbers, their addresses to the federal government. That we now know as a government where the individual people live. And if the protected status expires, they would be subject to deportation. Now, the administration can talk about prioritization all it wants. They can say they're going to go after criminal aliens before they're going to go after anyone like this. But the fact is, they would not have any kind of protected status. And these are people, most of whom they never knew another country other than the United States. Even if they were born somewhere else, which they would have been in these cases, they don't have any ties there, any roots there. Their parents moved them here. So the fact that you're subjecting those people to deportation, that's why you're seeing the very sharp reaction here, really on both sides, Republicans and Democrats both saying that this is not a compassionate way to handle it. In fact, it may even be an un-American way to handle it.
All right, our political director, Rick Klein, down in D.C. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Amna.
And thanks to all of you for watching as well. Remember, you can go to abcnews.com anytime for continuing coverage of the decision today from the administration to end DACA. Thanks for watching for now. I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.